The smell of bread stays with me. Specifically, the scent of fresh-baked grain bread cooling on wire racks in my father's bakery on Hive Primus, Sector 47, Level 193. The temperature in the bakery stayed consistent at 24 degrees Celsius, despite the fluctuations in the hive's climate control. My father maintained that temperature precisely because it allowed the bread to cool at the optimal rate. I was 22 years, 3 months, 17 days old. I had worked in that bakery since I was 7. I knew the smell of every variety we produced: grain, protein supplement, the expensive real wheat loaves we sold to mid-level administrative workers. The Planetary Defense Force came during the morning rush on the 3rd day of Secundus month. 14 soldiers in grey flak armor, carrying shock mauls and stub guns. They sealed both entrances to our hab block and began processing residents. My father and I were serving customers when they entered the bakery. The lead soldier, his flak vest had a sergeant's insignia, placed a data slate on the counter and told my father that Hive Primus had not met its Imperial Guard tithe quota for the current cycle. The quota was 7,000 recruits. The Hive had provided 4,800 through standard enlistment procedures. The remaining 2,200 would be collected through mandatory conscription. Our sector had been designated to provide 347 individuals. All males between ages 15 and 45 were subject to immediate collection. My father asked if there was appeal process, exemptions for essential workers. The bakery supplied 2,000 residents. Without bakers, the sector would experience food distribution failures. The sergeant said the Departmentum Munitorum did not recognize bakery work as essential to Imperial defense. He said we had 4 minutes to collect personal items before transport. He said resistance would be classified as refusal of lawful Imperial requisition and punished accordingly. I looked at my father. He was 53 years old, outside the conscription age range. He would continue operating the bakery. I would be collected. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The Imperium had requirements. We were being required. I went to the back room, where we stored supplies and retrieved a small pack. I placed 1 change of clothing inside, a water canister, a small metal icon of the Emperor that my father had given me when I began working in the bakery. These were my possessions. These were what I would carry to wherever the Imperium was sending me. When I returned to the front counter, 17 other people from our hab block had been assembled. I recognized all of them. Davius, who worked in the waste reclamation facility. His son Petran, 15 years old. Older brother Marcus, 19. Joram from the water distribution center. His father Silas and his younger brother Cale. Others, all males. All within the specified age range. The sergeant verified our identities against his data slate. We were logged as collected. Then we were led outside where a transport truck waited. The truck's cargo bed was already occupied by 43 people from adjacent sectors. We were ordered to board. The space was insufficient for 61 people. We pressed together, standing, holding whatever handholds were available on the truck's interior walls. My father stood in the doorway of the bakery and watched as they loaded us. I tried to memorize his face, the specific lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the scar on his left hand from a burn he had sustained years earlier. I attempted to preserve these details because I understood I would not see him again. The truck departed. We drove for 3 hours through the hive's transport corridors. No one spoke. We processed our situation in silence. At intervals, the truck stopped and collected additional people. By the time we reached the PDF staging area, 109 people occupied the cargo bed. The crowding was severe enough that several individuals lost consciousness from heat and insufficient oxygen. Their bodies were supported by the pressure of surrounding people until the truck stopped and they could be extracted. The staging area was a warehouse complex in the hive's industrial zone. The temperature outside was 37 degrees Celsius. We were unloaded from the truck and directed into lines. PDF soldiers with shock mauls ensured we maintained formation. I counted 9 trucks unloading simultaneously. Approximately 1,000 people were being processed. We stood in those lines for 6 hours. They gave us no water, no food, no explanation. People collapsed from heat exhaustion. The PDF soldiers would drag them to the side and leave them there. Some recovered, some did not. After 6 hours, processing began. They took us in groups of 50 into the warehouse. Inside, Adeptus Administratum clerks sat at tables with data slates and scanning equipment. Each person approached a table, provided their identification, submitted to retinal scanning and fingerprint recording. The clerk would verify their identity against the conscription database, then direct them to one of 3 exits. Most people went through the center exit. Some were directed to the left exit. These were individuals found to have medical conditions or other factors that disqualified them from Imperial Guard service. They would be returned to their sectors. A small number were directed to the right exit. I did not learn the significance of that designation until later. When my turn came, I approached the table and presented my identification. The clerk scanned it, performed the retinal and fingerprint verification, then asked my occupation. I said I was a baker. He asked my education level. I said I had completed standard hive school education through age 14, then apprenticed in my family's bakery. He asked if I had received any specialized technical training. I said no. He marked something on his data slate and directed me to the center exit. I proceeded through that exit into another section of the warehouse where approximately 600 people had already been gathered. We waited there for another 4 hours until the processing was complete. By the time they had finished, 947 people occupied that section. A PDF officer, his uniform indicated captain rank, addressed us from a raised platform. He said we had been selected for service in the Imperial Guard. We would be transported off-world to receive training and deployment. Service duration was 20 years or until death, whichever occurred first. Desertion or refusal to serve would result in immediate execution. Our families would be notified of our conscription and provided with documentation confirming our service to the Emperor. He said we should be proud. The Imperium faced threats across 1 million worlds. Every guardsman who served protected humanity from annihilation. Our lives would have purpose. Our deaths would have meaning. The Emperor demanded our service, and we would provide it. Then he told us to form lines for branding. I did not understand what he meant until they began the process. They had set up 10 stations along the far wall. Each station had a Medici servitor and a branding apparatus, a heated metal device connected to a power source. People were directed to these stations in groups of 10. They were required to remove their shirts. The servitor would verify their identity one final time, then apply the branding apparatus to their right shoulder. The brand burned an identification number into the skin. A 12-digit code that designated world of origin, conscription batch, and individual identifier. The process took approximately 7 seconds per person. The smell of burning flesh filled the warehouse. The screaming was continuous. When my turn came, I removed my shirt and approached the servitor. It was a heavily augmented human. Most of the skull had been replaced with machinery. Both arms were mechanical. The chest cavity was open to reveal various organs supported by metal frames. It scanned my identification, confirmed my designation, then activated the branding apparatus. The brand was heated to approximately 480 degrees Celsius. It made direct contact with my shoulder for 6.8 seconds. The pain was comprehensive, not localized to the shoulder but radiating through my entire right side. I did not scream. Many did. I processed the pain as information. This was happening. Recording the sensation would not prevent it. When the servitor removed the brand, I could see the number burned into my flesh. 772-3947-8814. That was my designation now. The person who had been a baker no longer existed in any official capacity. I was 772-3947-8814, conscript of the Imperial Guard, property of the Departamento Munitorum. They gave us gray uniforms after the branding, simple fatigues, boots, a cap. No insignia, no regiment identification. We were unassigned conscripts. We would receive proper uniforms after we reached our training facility. They distributed one meal, protein paste in sealed containers, water rations. Then they loaded us onto transport carriers and drove us to the starport. The journey took 2 hours. We sat in silence. Some people touched their brands, exploring the damage. Others stared forward, processing their transformation. I sat near the back of the carrier, next to a person approximately my age. His brand was 772-394-78791. 23 positions ahead of me in the processing sequence. I asked his name. He looked at me and said his name did not matter. He was 8,791 now. That was all the Imperium required of him. I said I was cold. He interrupted. He said using civilian names was pointless. We were conscripts, numbers, resources allocated to military service. Names were for people. We were not people anymore. I understood his logic but did not accept it fully. Not yet. I still remembered being a baker. I still thought of myself as someone who had existed before this day. That understanding would degrade over time, but in that moment, in the carrier, I was still transitioning. The starport occupied an entire section of the hive's uppermost level. We were driven directly to a landing platform where a bulk transport vessel waited. The ship was enormous, 3 kilometers in length, designed to carry cargo and personnel between worlds. Its hull was corroded, poorly maintained, covered in rust and the accumulated damage of centuries of service. But it was functional. That was sufficient. They loaded us through a cargo ramp into the ship's lower holds. The holds were designed for equipment storage, not human transport. They had installed temporary bunking, metal frames with thin mattresses, stacked 4 high, arranged in rows that filled the available space. Each hold accommodated approximately 800 people. We were distributed among them based on our processing batch numbers. I was assigned to hold 7, along with 793 other conscripts. We were given our bunk assignments and told to remain in the hold until further instruction. Then the cargo doors sealed. The temperature inside was 41 degrees Celsius. Ventilation was minimal. The air tasted of recycled staleness, industrial solvents, and the accumulated sweat of previous cargo. We waited in that hold for 14 hours before the ship departed. During that time, 3 people died from their branding wounds. Infections had set in rapidly, despite the cauterization. Their bodies were removed by servitors. No ceremony, no acknowledgement. Resources that had failed quality control. When the ship finally lifted, the vibration and acceleration were severe enough that several people vomited. The smell added to the existing atmosphere. We endured this for 6 hours until the ship completed its atmospheric departure and entered stable void transit. Then the acceleration normalized and we could move more freely within the hold. They provided 1 meal per day, nutrient paste, water rations, vitamin supplements, sufficient for survival, insufficient for comfort. Sanitation facilities consisted of open waste disposal units installed along one wall. Privacy was not considered relevant. The voyage lasted 43 days. During those 43 days, I observed the systematic breakdown of identity among the conscripts. People stopped using names. They referred to each other by the last 4 digits of their brand numbers. Conversations decreased. Social bonds dissolved. We existed in proximity without connection. But I noticed one person who resisted this pattern more than others. His designation was 772-3947-9103. He occupied the bunk directly below mine. He was younger than me, 17, perhaps 18. His brand wound had not healed properly. Infection had spread across his shoulder and down his arm. He needed medical treatment, but none was available. The Departamento Munitorum had provided no medical personnel for the transport. Conscripts who developed complications would either recover or die. The system was indifferent to which outcome occurred. 9,103 was dying. The infection had entered his bloodstream. Fever had developed. He shook constantly, his body attempting to fight a battle it would lose. I began giving him portion of my water ration. It would not save him, but it might extend his survival. I did not analyze why I made this choice. Some residual pattern from my previous existence, helping others, maintaining connections. The baker's son still functioning despite his transformation into 8,814. On the 17th day, 9,103 spoke to me. His voice was weak, distorted by fever. He said his name was Meris. He had worked in an assembly facility. He had a father and a younger brother. He wanted someone to remember that he had existed before he became a number. I told him my civilian designation, told him about the bakery, told him I would remember. He said the infection would kill him before we reached our destination. He asked if I thought the Emperor would recognize his service, if dying during transport qualified as dying in the Emperor's name. I said the ecclesiarchy taught that all service to the Imperium was service to the Emperor. Transportation was part of service. Therefore his death would be recognized. He said he hoped that was accurate. He said he wanted his death to mean something. He died on the 19th day. His body remained in the bunk below mine for 6 hours before servitors collected it. I observed them catalog his designation, record his death in their data system, then carry his body to the ship's disposal section. He would be processed into biomass and used as fertilizer or fuel. The Imperium wasted nothing. After they removed Meris's body, I attempted to preserve his memory as I had promised. But I discovered that recalling his specific features was difficult. I had been transitioning during our interactions. My observation patterns were becoming less detailed, more functional. I remembered his designation. I remembered that he had been infected. I remembered his fever, but his face was already fragmenting in my recall. This concerned me. I tried to preserve other memories deliberately. My father, the bakery, the smell of bread. But accessing those memories required effort. They were not degrading naturally. I was actively deprioritizing them because they interfered with adaptation to current circumstances. I understood that I was being processed, not through direct intervention, but through environmental pressure. The conditions in the hold, the lack of stimulation, the constant proximity to death, these factors were systematically breaking down the civilian person and replacing him with something that could function as a guardsman. The remaining 24 days of the voyage continued this process. More conscripts died from various causes: infection, illness, injuries sustained during violent altercations over resources, suicides. By the time we reached our destination, Hold 7's population had decreased from 794 to 709, acceptable wastage according to Departamento Munitorum standards. We made orbit around a world designated Telravan IV. The ship did not land. Instead, they transferred us to dropships, smaller vessels designed for planetary descent, 200 conscripts per dropship. We were loaded and launched within 3 hours of achieving orbit. The descent was violent. The dropships were designed for rapid deployment, not passenger comfort. We were strapped into harnesses and subjected to extreme acceleration and turbulence. Several conscripts lost consciousness. One died when his harness failed and he was thrown against the bulkhead. We landed at a military installation designated Training Facilities Sigma 947. The facility occupied approximately 200 square kilometers of barren terrain, prefabricated buildings arranged in precise geometric patterns, landing platforms, training grounds, firing ranges, housing blocks, everything necessary to process civilians into soldiers. They unloaded us and formed us into formation blocks of 100 conscripts each. We stood in those formations for 2 hours, while PDF trainers walked among us, evaluating our physical condition. Those judged unfit for training were removed immediately. I observed them being loaded onto separate transports. I later learned they were being sent to labor battalions, penal units that performed hazardous support functions. Life expectancy in labor battalions averaged 6 months. After the initial culling, 6,417 conscripts remained. We were divided into training companies of 500 each. I was assigned to Company Theta. along with 499 other conscripts, including several from Hold 7. Our first training cycle began the following day. Training lasted 14 weeks. They taught us basic infantry doctrine, how to maintain a lasgun, how to march in formation, how to dig defensive positions, how to identify enemy units. The instruction was efficient but minimal. We received no specialized training, no advanced tactics, no leadership development. We were being prepared to follow orders and die in appropriate formations. The trainers were PDF veterans, most of whom had served garrison duty on peaceful worlds. They taught us what they knew, which was adequate for basic competency, but insufficient for actual combat effectiveness. They told us this was intentional. The Departamento Munitorum required soldiers quickly and in large numbers. Extended training was too expensive when measured against projected casualty rates. One trainer, Sergeant Vorken, explained the mathematics during our 6th week. He said the Imperial Guard deployed approximately 50 million soldiers annually across active combat zones. First deployment casualty rates averaged 80 to 9% within the first 6 months of service. Training soldiers for years before deployment was inefficient because most would die before their training investment could be utilized. Therefore, the Departamento Munitorum provided minimal training and relied on natural selection. The 11% who survived their first deployment would receive additional training and become effective soldiers. The 89% would die, but they would die while performing their function, absorbing enemy fire, holding positions, delaying enemy advances. He said we should not interpret this as callousness. This was resource optimization. The Imperium could not afford to waste training resources on soldiers who would likely die regardless of preparation. We were receiving the training appropriate to our expected utility. I processed this information and understood that I was statistically unlikely to survive. My training would be insufficient. My equipment would be adequate, but not superior. I would be deployed against enemies who were better prepared, better equipped, and more experienced. My projected survival time was measured in weeks, possibly days. But I continued training, because the alternative was immediate execution or transfer to a labor battalion. I had been given a choice between probable death and certain death. I chose probable death. During the 9th week of training, I was assigned to a tactical squad, 10 conscripts who would deploy together and operate as a basic combat unit. I was designated 8814, Fire Team Leader, responsible for directing 4 other conscripts during operations. The squad included 8,791. The conscript from the transport carrier who had told me names did not matter. He had survived the voyage and training. He was competent with his lasgun and followed orders efficiently. The trainers had designated him as reliable. Another squad member was 772-394-79847. His civilian designation had been Tavern. He had worked in a water purification facility. He was 26 years old. During our 3rd week of training, he had asked me if I thought they would allow us to send messages to our families. I said the Departamento Munitorum did not typically provide communication access to conscripts. He said his father was elderly. His younger brother was only 12. They would need help maintaining the purification equipment. He wanted to send instructions, information that would allow them to continue operating the facility without him. I said we would likely not have that opportunity. He accepted this without further comment. But I observed him writing during our minimal free time. He was creating a manual, detailed instructions for maintaining water purification systems, troubleshooting common failures, safety protocols. He wrote in small, precise letters on scraps of packing material he had collected. He compiled hundreds of pages over the following weeks. I asked him what he intended to do with the manual. He said he knew he would likely die during deployment. He wanted to complete the manual before that occurred. He would request permission to send it to his family. If permission was denied, he would at least have created something. His knowledge would exist in documented form, even if it was never transmitted. I said that was reasonable planning. He said it helped him process the situation. He could not control his deployment or his probable death. He could control the manual. Creating it gave him purpose beyond waiting to die. I understood this. I had been using similar coping mechanisms, preserving memories of Meris, maintaining awareness of my civilian identity, documenting observations. We were both attempting to maintain agency in a system that had removed most forms of meaningful choice. Tavin, I continued thinking of him by his civilian name despite regulations, became the squad member I connected with most significantly. Not friendship in any traditional sense. Connection based on recognition. He was processing his transformation similarly to how I was processing mine. We both understood what we were becoming and mourned what we had been while simultaneously adapting to what we now were. During week 12, training intensity increased. They deployed us on mock combat operations, simulated battles against trainer forces representing various enemy types. The simulations were comprehensive. We experienced live fire, explosive effects, chemical irritants meant to simulate battlefield conditions. Casualty rates during these exercises were significant. 17 conscripts from Company Theta died during training operations. The trainers logged them as acceptable training losses. During one simulation, our squad was assigned to hold a defensive position against a trainer assault. The position was intentionally indefensible. We lacked sufficient cover. Our fields of fire were restricted. Our flanks were exposed. The trainers attacked with overwhelming force. They used non-lethal ammunition, but the impacts were still damaging. Within 4 minutes, 7 members of our squad had been incapacitated. Only Tavin, 8,791, and I remained functional. We maintained our position despite understanding the situation was hopeless. We continued firing until the trainers overran our position and declared us eliminated. After the exercise, Sergeant Vulcan evaluated our performance. He said we had performed adequately. We had maintained discipline despite overwhelming disadvantage. We had continued fighting until eliminated. This was exactly what the Imperial Guard required. Soldiers who would hold positions until death, regardless of tactical futility. He said the position had been designed to be indefensible. The purpose was not to win, but to delay the enemy force. Every minute we survived allowed other units to reposition. Our deaths would be tactically useful, even if individually meaningless. He said this would be the nature of most deployments we experienced. We would be positioned in locations where casualty rates were expected to be total. We would hold those positions because holding them served the larger strategic purpose. Our individual survival was not the objective. Our collective function was the objective. I processed this explanation and recognized it as accurate description of my probable future. I would be deployed to a position where I was expected to die. I would die there. My death would contribute marginally to overall strategic success. The Imperium would continue operating without any awareness that I had existed. This was acceptable. Not desired, but acceptable. I had been conscripted. I had been processed. I had been trained. I would perform my function. The emotional response I might have experienced as a civilian, fear, anger, despair, had been systematically reduced to background noise. I was adapting. Training concluded in week 14. We were formed into regiments of 5,000 soldiers each and assigned our deployments. I was designated as member of the 772nd Telravan Infantry Regiment. We received our regimental uniforms, our standard-issue equipment, and our deployment orders. We were being sent to a world called Varsavia, where Imperial forces were engaged with Orc Xenos in a contested industrial zone. Our regiment would reinforce defensive positions and absorb the primary assault waves. Projected casualty rates for first week operations, 73%. Projected casualty rates for first month operations, 94%. They gave us these statistics during the deployment briefing. The regimental commander, Colonel Havrim, said we should be proud. We were being deployed to critical combat operations where our service would have maximum impact. The Emperor required our sacrifice. We would provide it. We boarded transport ships 3 days later. The conditions were similar to our initial voyage. Overcrowded holds, minimal resources, no comfort. The transit to Varsavia took 61 days. During that time, I observed Tavin completing his manual. He had filled every available space with instructions, diagrams, safety procedures. The document was comprehensive, a complete guide to maintaining water purification systems in a hive environment. On the 58th day, he asked me to hold the manual. He said if he died during the initial deployment, I should attempt to preserve it. Perhaps send it to his family if communication became possible. If I also died, then at least he had tried. I accepted the manual and stored it with my limited personal items. I said I would attempt to preserve it. He said he appreciated that. He said knowing the manual existed made his probable death easier to process. His knowledge would survive even if he did not. 3 days later, we reached Varsavia. The world was a forge world, heavily industrialized, atmosphere thick with chemical pollutants. We could see the combat zones from orbit, entire sections of the planet's surface burning, massive explosions creating visible light patterns, even through the atmospheric haze. They deployed us directly into combat. No acclimatization period, no additional briefing. We loaded into dropships and descended into an active combat zone. The drop was more violent than our training facility landing. Enemy anti-aircraft fire damaged several ships. I observed one dropship take a direct hit and disintegrate, killing all 200 conscripts aboard instantly. Our ship survived the descent and landed on a designated landing zone approximately 3 kilometers behind the current front line. We disembarked under artillery fire. Explosions created craters across the landing zone. Shrapnel from near misses killed conscripts before they could fully exit the ships. Our squad maintained cohesion. We formed up as trained and advanced toward our assigned position. The environment was overwhelming. Constant noise from weapons fire and explosions, smoke reducing visibility to less than 20 meters, the smell of promethium and burning flesh, ground vibrating from artillery impacts. We moved through destroyed industrial facilities toward our defensive position. Bodies were everywhere, Imperial Guard casualties from previous waves, orc corpses, destroyed vehicles. We advanced past them without stopping. They were data points. Evidence of previous failures and successes, not relevant to our immediate function. We reached our position after 47 minutes of movement. It was a trench system, partially collapsed, occupied by the surviving members of a previous regiment. I counted 19 soldiers where there should have been approximately 200. They had been holding this position for 11 days. They looked exhausted, malnourished, damaged. Their sergeant briefed us on the tactical situation. The orcs attacked in waves, typically during dawn and dusk periods. The attacks were poorly coordinated but overwhelming in numbers. Our function was to hold the trench system and prevent breakthrough. Artillery support was limited. Resupply was irregular. Casualty evacuation was not available. He said our regiment would likely be eliminated within 2 weeks. That was standard duration for regiments deployed to this sector. Then another regiment would arrive and continue holding the position. He said the Emperor recognized our service. Then he and his surviving soldiers withdrew to a rear position, leaving us to man the trenches. We had been on Varsavia for less than 2 hours. We were now frontline combat troops. The first orc attack came 6 hours later, during the dusk period, as the previous sergeant had predicted. I observed them approaching through the industrial ruins. Massive humanoid figures, 2.5 to 3 meters tall, heavily muscled, carrying crude but effective weapons. They advanced without formation, roaring, firing projectile weapons indiscriminately. We engaged them at maximum lasgun range. My squad occupied a section of trench approximately 15 meters long. We had clear fields of fire across 200 meters of open terrain. The orcs crossed that terrain rapidly despite our fire. We killed many of them. More kept coming. They reached our trench line. Close combat began. I had trained for this scenario, but training was insufficient preparation for the reality. The orcs were stronger than humans by significant margin. When they entered the trenches, they killed with physical force as much as with weapons. I observed one orc grab a conscript from my squad and tear him apart, literally, the bodies separated under the force applied. I shot that orc in the head at point-blank range. The last round burned through its skull and it collapsed. Another orc entered my position immediately. I shot it as well. And another, and another. The attack lasted 23 minutes. Then the orcs withdrew. We had held the position. I assessed casualties. My squad of 10 conscripts now numbered 6. 4 had been killed during the assault. Their bodies remained in the trench. We had no capacity to remove them. I checked on the survivors. 8,791 was functional, undamaged. 2 others, 8,734 and 9,201, were wounded but mobile. 1 conscript, 8,456, was severely wounded, likely dying, and Tavin was missing. I found him 8 meters down the trench line. An orc projectile had struck him in the chest. The wound was catastrophic. His flak armor had been penetrated. The round had destroyed his chest cavity. He was still breathing, still conscious. I approached him and knelt beside his position. His eyes focused on me with effort. Recognition occurred. He attempted to speak, but his lungs were too damaged. Blood filled his mouth. He tried again, forcing words through the damage. He said the manual. He needed to know about the manual. I told him I still had it. I had preserved it. He asked if I would try to send it to his family. I said I would attempt to do so if circumstances permitted. He said that was sufficient. He said he had completed what he could complete. He had documented his knowledge. He had served as required. He was ready to stop. I observed him process this conclusion. He was not afraid, not angry. He was simply completing his function and accepting termination. The person who had been a water purification technician had been successfully transformed into a guardsman. He had fought. He had held his position. Now he was dying. This was the expected outcome. I remained beside him and observed his biological processes failing in sequence. His breathing became irregular, periods of rapid respiration followed by extended pauses. His heart rate increased as his cardiovascular system attempted to compensate for massive blood loss. His pupils dilated. His skin temperature decreased as circulation concentrated on core functions. He maintained eye contact with me throughout this process, not speaking, simply existing. Aware that I was witnessing his termination, I think this mattered to him, that someone observed, that his death was recorded by another consciousness, even if only briefly. His breathing stopped at minute 4, second 38 of my observation. His heart continued beating for another 17 seconds, then ceased. His pupils remained dilated. His body remained warm for several minutes as residual heat dissipated. I had known him for 14 weeks. He had been competent, thoughtful, someone who attempted to maintain purpose despite systematic dehumanization. He had created a comprehensive manual documenting his professional knowledge because maintaining that knowledge mattered to him more than survival. He had died in a trench on a world he had never heard of before deployment, killed by Xenos he had no personal conflict with, serving an Imperium that would not record his individual existence. I processed this death and recognized it as the pattern that would repeat. Tavin would not be the last squad member I observed dying. He would not be the most tragic death I witnessed. He was simply the first. The baseline against which future deaths would be measured. I returned to my position and continued my function. The orcs would attack again. I would fight again. I or my squad members would die. Eventually, I would die. This was the expected sequence. But I maintained possession of Tavin's manual. I had made a commitment to attempt its preservation. This gave me a purpose beyond simple survival. A reason to continue functioning that extended past my immediate tactical requirements. The attacks continued. Every 12 hours approximately, the orcs would assault our position. We would repel them with casualties. Our effective strength decreased with each engagement. Resupply came irregularly, ammunition, rations, replacement conscripts to fill losses. The replacements were identically trained, identically equipped, identically expendable. After 1 week, my original squad of 10 had been completely eliminated. I was the sole survivor. The 6 conscripts now operating under my designation were replacements. None of them had been present during Tavin's death. After 2 weeks, I had cycled through 23 different squad members. 18 had been killed. 4 had been wounded severely enough to be evacuated to rear positions. 1 had suffered psychological breakdown and been removed by commissariat personnel. I continued functioning. Not because I maintained hope for survival. Not because I believed in the strategic necessity of holding this position. I continued because that was my function. I was a guardsman. Guardsmen held positions until eliminated. The system required this. I provided it. During the 3rd week, a commissar arrived to inspect our section of the front line. Commissar Mathran, attached to our regiment for morale enforcement. He walked through the trenches observing the conscripts, evaluating our effectiveness. He stopped at my position and reviewed my service record on his data slate. He noted that I had survived 3 weeks of continuous combat. He asked how I had managed this when casualty rates for my position averaged 97%. I said I followed tactical doctrine, maintained discipline, and adapted to battlefield conditions as trained. He said my survival was statistically anomalous. He asked if I understood why I had survived when so many others had died. I said probability required that some percentage of deployed forces survive. I appeared to fall within that percentage. The reasons were likely random rather than attributable to superior skill. He said that was incorrect analysis. I had survived because the Emperor willed it. My continued existence served his purpose. I should interpret my survival as evidence of divine favor and continue serving with appropriate devotion. I said I would continue serving as required. He said he would note my exemplary service in his report. Then he moved on to inspect other positions. After he departed, I considered his interpretation. That my survival was evidence of the Emperor's favor rather than statistical probability. I did not find this explanation compelling. I had observed too many competent soldiers die, and too many incompetent soldiers survive to accept that survival correlated with divine will or personal capability. Survival appeared to be primarily random, with minor influence from tactical competence. But the Commissar's interpretation was the official framework. Guardsmen who survived were blessed by the Emperor. Guardsmen who died had served his will through their sacrifice. Either outcome proved the Emperor's wisdom. The logic was comprehensive and unfalsifiable. I did not believe this framework, but I performed its rituals because performance was required. Before combat operations, I spoke the prayers I had been taught. After successful defense, I gave the appropriate thanks. When squad members died, I recited the liturgies, not because I believed the words had power, but because the system required their performance. In the 4th week, I was promoted to sergeant, not because I had requested promotion or demonstrated leadership capability beyond basic competency. I was promoted because the previous sergeants in my section had all been killed, and I had survived longer than anyone else. Survival was qualification sufficient for leadership. As sergeant, I was responsible for 30 conscripts distributed across 3 trench sections. I coordinated their defensive positions, managed ammunition distribution, filed casualty reports, and maintained communication with company command. My tactical authority was minimal, but my administrative responsibilities increased significantly. I performed these functions adequately. I did not excel. Excellence was not required. I simply needed to maintain the position and ensure the conscripts under my authority continued fighting until they were eliminated. During the 6th week, we received reinforcements. 200 conscripts arrived from the same training facility where I had been processed. They were identically trained, identically equipped. They carried the same statistical probability of death I had carried when I deployed. I was assigned to provide tactical orientation to 1 squad of these replacements, 10 conscripts who had never experienced combat. I was supposed to prepare them for the reality they would face. I gathered them in a rear trench section and provided the orientation briefing. I told them the orcs attacked approximately every 12 hours. I told them to conserve ammunition, aim for headshots, maintain their positions regardless of casualties. I told them their projected survival time was 7 to 9 days based on current casualty rates. One conscript, his designation was 847-5518-3341, asked if there was any way to improve those survival odds. I said following doctrine reduced risk marginally. Luck and position assignment were more significant factors. Some positions received heavier assault concentration and experienced higher casualty rates. There was no reliable method for predicting which positions would be targeted. He asked if I had any advice for maintaining psychological stability during combat. I said psychological stability was less important than continued function. Fear, despair, hope, these emotional states would occur regardless of intention. What mattered was continuing to perform required actions despite those states. Fire your weapon, hold your position. Follow orders. If you could maintain those functions, the emotional state was irrelevant. He said that was not reassuring. I said reassurance was not my function. Accurate information was my function. I concluded the briefing and assigned them to their positions. They deployed the following morning. Within 3 days, 8 of the 10 had been killed. The remaining 2 survived for another week before being eliminated. I continued recruiting replacement conscripts, providing orientation briefings, watching them die. The cycle repeated every 7 to 11 days. New conscripts arrived. I briefed them. They deployed. They died. I filed casualty reports. New conscripts arrived. I had become part of the system that consumed them, not through deliberate choice, but through continued survival. By existing longer than they did, by possessing slightly more experience, I was positioned as the authority who prepared them for death. I was complicit in their processing. I could have warned them more explicitly, could have told them the Imperium was using them as expendable resources, could have suggested desertion or resistance. But these options were meaningless. Warning them would not change their deployment. Desertion was impossible. We were on a front line with no escape route. Resistance would result in immediate execution by commissariat forces. My only choice was between preparing them adequately for their function or preparing them inadequately. I chose adequate preparation because that at least gave them maximum probability of surviving slightly longer. But this choice made me complicit. I was training conscripts to die efficiently. I was perpetuating the system that had consumed me by ensuring it could continue consuming others. In the 9th week, I was summoned to company command. Captain Sevigny wanted to discuss my continued survival. He said I had now outlasted 96% of conscripts deployed to this sector. He asked me to document my tactical methods so they could be distributed to other sergeants. I said my methods were not exceptional. I followed doctrine and adapted to circumstances. He said, nevertheless, my survival suggested superior tactical awareness. I should document my approach for potential inclusion in updated training protocols. I prepared the documentation as ordered. It was brief. Maintain position, conserve ammunition, coordinate fire to maximize efficiency, adapt positions based on enemy approach patterns. Nothing exceptional, nothing that was not already included in standard doctrine. I submitted the documentation. Captain Sevigny reviewed it and said it was insufficient. He said I must be omitting critical information. No one survived 9 weeks through standard doctrine alone. I said I had provided complete documentation of my tactical methods. If he believed I was omitting information, he was incorrect. He said perhaps I was not consciously aware of what made me effective. Perhaps my tactical instincts operated below conscious recognition. He would assign combat observers to document my actions during the next engagement. During the following orc assault, 3 observers positioned themselves near my section and recorded my actions. They documented my fire discipline, my positioning, my orders to subordinate conscripts. After the engagement concluded, they compiled their observations and submitted them to Captain Sevigny. He reviewed their report and called me to command again. He said the observers had confirmed that my tactics were standard doctrine, executed competently, but not exceptionally. My survival appeared to be primarily attributable to probability and position assignment rather than superior skill. He said this was disappointing. He had hoped to identify replicable methods that could improve overall survival rates. Instead, he had confirmed that survival was essentially random. This information was not useful for improving training protocols. He dismissed me. I returned to my position and continued my function. The observation had confirmed what I already understood. I had survived through probability, not capability. The Imperium had wanted my survival to mean something, to provide data that could improve system efficiency. But my survival meant nothing except that I had been randomly selected by circumstance to continue existing slightly longer than average. In week 12, I experienced isolation. An artillery strike collapsed the trench section adjacent to my position. Debris blocked both access points to my section. I was trapped with 3 subordinate conscripts in a sealed trench segment approximately 20 meters long. Communication equipment had been damaged in the collapse. We had no contact with command. We had no method to signal our location. We had 4 days of rations and water. We had ammunition sufficient for 1 defensive engagement. The conscripts became increasingly distressed as our situation became clear. We were isolated. Rescue was unlikely. The regiment did not have engineering assets to clear collapsed trenches. We could attempt to dig ourselves out, but the debris mass was substantial. Manual excavation would take days, possibly weeks. I evaluated our options. Wait for rescue that likely would not come, attempt excavation with insufficient tools, or preserve our resources and maintain position until our supplies exhausted. All options resulted in eventual death through different mechanisms. I chose to maintain position and preserve resources. We would continue performing our defensive function as long as possible. If orcs attacked our section, we would engage them. If they did not, we would remain in position until our supplies exhausted. The 3 subordinate conscripts questioned this decision. They wanted to attempt excavation. They believed we could dig out within 3 or 4 days. I said excavation was possible but unlikely to succeed. The debris mass was too large. We would exhaust ourselves attempting to move it and still be trapped. They said doing nothing meant accepting death. I said all options meant accepting death. I was choosing the option that allowed us to continue performing our function longest. They accepted this because I held authority, not because they agreed with the assessment. We settled into waiting. The first day was tolerable. We maintained watch rotations, conserved energy, rationed our supplies precisely. The second day was more difficult. The trapped conscripts became agitated. They wanted to attempt excavation despite my orders. I maintained discipline through authority and the threat of commissariat consequences if they disobeyed. By the 3rd day, our isolation had created sensory deprivation conditions. The trench was dark. Our lumen devices had limited power. Sound was muffled by the debris blocking our exits. We had no external stimuli except each other. Time became difficult to track. We maintained approximate hour counts through internal estimation, but accuracy degraded. I experienced isolation in ways I had not experienced since becoming a guardsman. For 12 weeks, I had been continuously engaged, fighting, briefing replacements, filing reports, managing positions. I had not been alone with my thoughts for more than brief periods. Now, trapped in darkness with minimal stimulation, my mind accessed memories and patterns I had been suppressing. I thought about my father, about the bakery, about the smell of bread. These memories were distant, fragmentary. The person who had been a baker seemed almost fictional, a character from a story rather than my actual past. But the memories persisted. They existed in archive, accessible if I chose to access them. I thought about Maris, the conscript who had died during transport. I had promised to remember him. I had failed. I could not recall his face clearly. I could not remember the specific details of our conversations. I remembered only that he had existed and that I had promised. The promise had been inadequate to preserve his memory against the degradation caused by my transformation. I thought about Tavern. I still carried his manual. I had maintained possession through 12 weeks of combat, but I had not attempted to send it to his family. I had not even attempted to determine if sending messages to families was possible. I had simply archived the commitment and continued performing my immediate functions. The manual existed, the promise existed, but neither had been acted upon. I recognized a pattern in these reflections. I preserved things inadequately. I made commitments I did not fully honor. I attempted to maintain humanity through symbolic gestures while allowing the substance to erode. The manual represented Tavern's purpose, but I had reduced it to cargo I carried without transmitting. Maris's memory existed, but only as abstraction. The bakery existed, but only as fragmentary sensory data. I was maintaining the appearance of continuity with my previous existence, while allowing that existence to degrade into archived data I rarely accessed. I was performing humanity while becoming something else. On the fourth day, we heard excavation sounds. Someone was clearing the debris from the opposite side. We signaled our presence by striking the trench walls with our equipment. The excavation intensified. After 3 hours, they cleared sufficient debris to create an opening. Regiment engineers extracted us from the collapsed section. We were evaluated medically, malnourished, dehydrated, but functional. We were returned to duty immediately. I filed my report on the isolation incident. Captain Sevignier read it and commended me for maintaining discipline during difficult circumstances. He said my leadership had prevented panic and ensured the conscripts remained functional. He noted this commendation in my service record. I accepted the commendation without comment. I had not maintained discipline to ensure the conscripts remained functional. I had maintained discipline because that was my default pattern. I had chosen to wait in darkness because attempting to escape seemed inefficient. The conscript's functionality had been incidental to my decision-making, but the official framework required interpreting my actions as leadership and devotion to duty. My actual motivations were irrelevant. The system required certain narratives. I provided them. After the isolation incident, I noticed my detachment had increased. The memories I had accessed during isolation remained accessible, but they felt even more distant. Reviewing them had not reconnected me to my previous existence. It had simply demonstrated how thoroughly I had been transformed. In week 15, we received a new conscript designated 847-551-87793. He was assigned to my section as a replacement for casualties. During his orientation, I noticed he asked similar questions to those other conscripts had asked. He wanted to know how to improve his survival probability. He wanted advice on maintaining psychological stability. I provided the same responses I had provided to previous conscripts. Follow doctrine. Continue functioning regardless of emotional state. Accept statistical probability of death. He said another sergeant had told him the Emperor protected the faithful, that maintaining strong belief improved survival rates. I said that was one interpretation. Another interpretation was that survivors attributed their survival to faith retroactively. Correlation versus causation. The data did not support either interpretation conclusively. He said I seemed doubtful about the Emperor's protection. I said doubt was irrelevant. I performed required duties regardless of belief. Whether the Emperor protected the faithful or survival was random probability made no difference to my tactical decisions. He said that was borderline heretical. I said heresy was questioning the Emperor's authority or the Imperium's legitimacy. I did neither. I simply acknowledged that my understanding of divine intervention was limited and potentially inaccurate. I performed rituals as required while maintaining uncertainty about their efficacy. This was not heresy. This was appropriate epistemic humility. He said he would prefer to believe the Emperor protected him. I said he was welcome to maintain that belief. It might provide psychological comfort even if it did not affect survival probability. He deployed 3 days later. He survived for 6 days before being killed by orc weapons fire. His belief had not measurably improved his survival duration. I filed his casualty report and continued my function. The weeks compressed after that. Each week was similar to the previous. Orc attacks, casualties, replacements, briefings, reports. The cycle repeated without meaningful variation. I tracked time through my casualty reports. Each conscript's death was a temporal marker. I had processed 174 casualties by week 20, 209 by week 25, 241 by week 30. I was now among the longest-serving guardsmen in the entire regiment. 99.2% of our original deployment strength had been eliminated. Most had been replaced multiple times. The regiment's designation remained the 772nd Telravan Infantry, but the actual personnel had cycled through complete replacement 6 times. I was one of approximately 40 original conscripts still functioning. We were statistical anomalies. Probability required that some small percentage survive extended deployments. We had randomly fallen within that percentage. Colonel Havrim recognized this during a regimental formation in week 32. He called forward the surviving original conscripts and commended us for exemplary service. He said we were proof that faith and discipline ensured survival. We were examples for newer conscripts to emulate. I stood in formation and received this commendation. I did not believe his interpretation. Faith and discipline had not ensured my survival. Probability and position assignment had. But I accepted the commendation because accepting it was required. After the formation, one of the other surviving original conscripts approached me. His designation was 772-3947-2847. I recognized him from the initial transport voyage. He had been in Hold 4. He said he remembered me from the ship. He asked if I remembered him. I said I did not. Hold 4 had been separated from Hold 7. We had not interacted during the voyage. He said he remembered seeing me during one of the rare periods when they allowed conscripts from different holds into the common areas. He remembered because I had been helping another conscript who was ill, giving him water rations. Most conscripts had refused to share resources. I had shared. I said I did not remember that incident specifically. I had helped several ill conscripts during the voyage. Most had died regardless. He said he had noticed the pattern, that I attempted to help others even when helping was tactically inefficient. He asked why I continued doing this. I said I did not know. Some residual pattern from my previous existence. The baker's son helping others because that was what baker's sons did. The pattern persisted despite its inefficiency. He said he thought that was why I had survived, not because of tactical superiority or divine favor. Because I maintained connection to other conscripts, because I treated them as people rather than as interchangeable resources. This created resilience that pure tactical competence did not provide. I said that was an interesting theory, but probably inaccurate. My survival was most likely random. He said he preferred his interpretation. It suggested survival had meaning beyond probability. He died 4 days later when an orc artillery strike obliterated his trench section. His interpretation of my survival became irrelevant. I continued functioning. The orc assaults continued. The casualties continued. The replacements continued. I had existed in this pattern for 33 weeks, 8 months, 231 days. I had survived the 11% threshold. I had survived the 6-month average. I was now in extended service territory where survival became increasingly anomalous. In week 35, I made a decision. I requested permission to attempt communication with my home world. I wanted to send Tavin's manual to his family. I had carried it for 9 months. I had preserved it through dozens of combat engagements. I had made a commitment to attempt transmission. I was now attempting to honor that commitment. The regimental communications officer said sending personal messages to conscript families was not supported by Departamento Munitorum protocols. Communication bandwidth was reserved for tactical and strategic purposes. Personal communication was classified as frivolous resource allocation. I said the manual contained technical information that could benefit Imperial citizens on my home world. It was documentation of water purification procedures. This had potential strategic value. He said technical documentation should be transmitted through proper administrative channels. Individual guardsmen did not have authority to distribute technical information. I said I understood. I asked if there were proper channels I could access. He said there were channels, but processing time was measured in years, possibly decades. By the time the manual was reviewed, approved, and transmitted, the information would likely be obsolete, or the recipients would be deceased. I said I understood. I thanked him for the information. I returned to my position and opened Tavin's manual. I reviewed the pages he had written with such precision, the detailed diagrams, the safety procedures, the troubleshooting guides. He had created this documentation to ensure his knowledge survived. He had given it to me because he believed I would preserve it. I had preserved the physical document, but I had not fulfilled the actual purpose, transmission to his family. I lacked the authority or resources to accomplish transmission. Therefore, I had failed the commitment. I considered destroying the manual. It served no function if it could not be transmitted. Carrying it was simply cargo weight with no tactical benefit, but I could not destroy it. Destroying it would complete the failure. As long as the manual existed, the possibility of eventual transmission remained. I returned it to my equipment. I would continue carrying it. I would continue attempting to preserve it, even though preservation without transmission was inadequate fulfillment of my commitment. This was the nature of choice within the Imperial Guard. I possessed agency. I could choose to carry the manual or destroy it. I could choose to attempt transmission or abandon the attempt. But all choices produced variations of the same outcome, inadequate fulfillment of commitments made before I understood the system's constraints. Freedom to choose was not freedom to accomplish. In week 38, the Orc assaults stopped. We maintained our positions and waited for the next attack. It did not come. After 48 hours without contact, reconnaissance patrols were sent forward to determine enemy positions. They reported the Orcs had withdrawn from our sector. They had not been defeated. They had simply redeployed to a different region where Imperial resistance was weaker. We received orders to hold our current positions, pending further instruction. We held for 6 days. Then we received orders to advance and occupy the abandoned Orc positions. We advanced through the industrial ruins the Orcs had occupied. The devastation was comprehensive. Everything had been destroyed or stripped for scrap. Bodies, human and Orc, lay unrecovered in various stages of decomposition. The smell was distinctive. Biological decay accelerated by chemical pollutants and high ambient temperature. We established new defensive positions in the abandoned Orc fortifications. These positions were actually superior to our previous trenches. Better cover, better fields of fire, better supply access. We had spent 9 months fighting to advance 3 kilometers into positions the Orcs had abandoned voluntarily. I processed this information and recognized the pattern. The strategic purpose of our deployment had not been to defeat the Orcs. It had been to occupy their attention while more important operations occurred elsewhere. We had held positions, absorbed casualties, and prevented the Orcs from redeploying. We had succeeded at that function regardless of our tactical wins or losses in our specific sector. 287 conscripts had died in my section alone during those 9 months. They had died to delay Orcs who were never our strategic priority. Their deaths had been useful but not critical. They had been expendable resources allocated to expendable mission. This was what the Imperium was. Not the grand narrative of humanity's eternal struggle. Not the mythology of the Emperor's divine protection. The Imperium was the systematic conversion of individuals into expendable resources. It identified how many humans it could afford to lose in each sector, allocated that number of soldiers, and processed them through combat until the required casualties had been achieved. I had been allocated to Varsavia. I had been expected to die within weeks. I had survived 9 months instead. This was statistical anomaly, not divine favor or tactical superiority. Eventually, probability would correct itself. I would be killed, and another conscript would be allocated to replace me. The system would continue operating without acknowledging I had existed. I understood this completely now. The transformation that had begun in the transport carrier 43 weeks earlier was complete. I was no longer the baker's son who remembered bread and family. I was 772. 3947 8814. Sergeant in the Imperial Guard, a component of the machine that consumed humans and converted them into tactical delay. I existed. I functioned. I processed replacement conscripts and filed casualty reports and maintained defensive positions. I carried Tavin's manual, though I could not transmit it. I remembered Maris, though I could not recall his face. I performed the rituals, though I did not believe their theology. I was complicit in the system's operation. By surviving, by training replacements, by continuing to function, I enabled the processing of additional conscripts. I had become what the baker's son would have feared, an instrument of the Imperium's hunger, perpetuating the cycle that had consumed him. The temperature in the fortification is 39 degrees Celsius, higher than the bakery, higher than my father's precisely maintained 24 degrees Celsius. I remember that temperature as data. The sensation is gone. The person who experienced comfort at 24 degrees Celsius is archived, rarely accessed, fundamentally separate from what I am now. I continue training replacements. They arrive from the same facility where I was processed. They carry the same statistical probability of death I carried. I provide them orientation briefings that prepare them to die efficiently. I am good at this function. I have performed it 147 times across 9 months. The newest replacement asked me yesterday if it becomes easier. Watching others die. Filing the reports. Continuing to function. I told him it does not become easier. It becomes normal. The distinction matters. Easier suggests improvement. Normal suggests adaptation without improvement. You do not suffer less. You simply process suffering as background data, while continuing to function. He asked if I still thought about the people I had known before conscription. I said I retained memory archives of those individuals, but accessing them required deliberate effort. They were data, not current experience. The person who had known them was archived similarly. He said that was bleak. I said it was accurate. He deployed this morning. He will likely die within the week. I will file his casualty report and train his replacement. The cycle will continue because the cycle is the system, and the system is all that exists at sufficient scale. This is what the Imperium costs. Not just the deaths of individual soldiers, the systematic conversion of individuals into instruments that perpetuate their own consumption. We are not victims. We are components. We enable the processing of others by surviving slightly longer than they do. I process this understanding and continue my function because I have no alternative. Because the system has removed all alternatives except variations of compliance. Because I made choices to carry the manual, to train replacements, to maintain my position, and those choices bound me to this continuation. The smell is different now. Not bread, promethium, decay, recycled air, chemical pollutants. This is my environment. This is what I know. I remember 24 degrees Celsius. I remember my father's face. These memories confirm I was human once. Now I am what remains after the Imperium has processed that human into something functional. The temperature is 39 degrees Celsius. I document this because documentation is what I do. I record, I report, I archive. I testify this is my testament. This is what I became. The system continues. I continue. The distinction has ceased to matter.